Welcome to the CALPADS Spring Data Roadshow. My name is Brandy Jauregui. I'm an information technology supervisor at the California Department of Education in the Special Education Division. So also with me today on the Zoom, I have an amazing team. So Milo New, who is a research data specialist in my office, as well as Dominic Johnson, who I stole from Fresno County CELPA, right? And how many of you, do all of you use SACE? Okay. Is there anybody that does not use SACE as a special education data system here? Okay. So Dominic is an amazing resource because he was a SACE user for 8 years. And so he can answer some of those questions. So I will try and articulate your question. If it's a SACE question that I can't answer, I'm going to ask Dominic to do that. Also, Christopher Williams, who is another research data specialist that I've got in my team, they're going to be answering questions on the Zoom. And then if we have questions within that Q&A or chat, they're going to go ahead and bring them up and we can address them for the entire group. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. If you have questions about some of the content, CALPADS related questions, meaning reports you're seeing in CALPADS or submission issues, errors that you're experiencing, please go ahead and send those to the service desk and they will be routed to my team. But if you have policy or program related questions, a lot of the questions that they're seeing in the service desk right now are annual determination questions and disproportionality and significant disproportionality. Don't send those through the service desk because ultimately it takes a while for them to get routed, right? Program policy related questions, please send them to SPED data support. Is there anybody here that is not part of the CALPADS SPED support listserv? Okay, hopefully all of you have subscribed to that listserv because I do send out very frequent messages in now what is much more timely fashion than the CALPADS office is getting information out. So please subscribe to that listserv if you have not done so already. Did everybody get the box link to the materials? Okay, great. Now, if you downloaded that PowerPoint like a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, we've made little tweaks to it. Okay, so just be aware of that. And you may want to download the most recent one at some point if you did that. Okay, so here's what we're going to be talking about today. The IEP implementation data collection. Then we're going to go into CALPADS monitoring report 16.21, which we get so many questions about. So I want to address all of your issues and concerns today. Then we're going to talk about the things that you need to do to prepare for end of year. So we're going to look at the deadlines, look at a proposed calendar that you could use, and also, most importantly, what are the local audits that you need to do within SACE before you even start looking at some of those errors that are in CALPADS. We're going to go into data submission and error resolution and talk about some of the most high frequency data discrepancies that you're seeing, including some of the ones that you're seeing right now and why they're happening. Then we're going to take a break, review some end of year reports, talk about some other audits that you can do to prepare for fall 1 and then 2024-25 changes. So any questions before we get started? All righty. I'm going to take off these glasses because I cannot see far away. Here are all the acronyms that I'm going to be covering today, or you're going to see these proliferated throughout this presentation. So there's a lot of them because CD is really good at creating acronyms. Most of these, all of you know what these are. Okay, so how many of you are special education data coordinators? Okay, so you work directly in SACE. Okay, CALPADS administrators. Okay, good. And what about special education administrators, CELPA level, special education directors, teachers, case managers? Okay, so I'm glad that we've got a really nice mixed bag here today. The two terms that I want to bring to all of the special education data coordinators' attention are SPP and APR, okay? State Performance Plan and Annual Performance Reports. So for the directors, you're probably very familiar with what those are, correct? Yeah, you're very familiar with what those are. But special education data coordinators don't understand typically what those are. So the state performance plan is a plan that California puts together, and it looks at data for students with disabilities that fall within 17 different areas, or primarily it's 14 different, what they call indicators. Okay, it's things like what percentage of students with disabilities graduate within the 4-year cohort? What percentage of students with disabilities are identified as dropouts? What percentage of your school-age students are in regular classroom settings versus separate schools? Okay, it's things like that. And all of the data that we use for that state performance plan and your annual performance report, it comes from CALPADS. So in that state performance plan, for every year, the state sets a specific target that districts are required to meet. Okay, so your directors are looking at your data and the data that you submit and how close the district is to meeting that target every year. Okay, so that's why you're going to hear me refer to the annual performance report many, many times today, federal indicators, because it's important that you review those data, make sure that they're of very good integrity, because it's used oftentimes in the annual determination letters. Okay, so annual determination letters basically use those data to put your districts in special education monitoring tier. And sometimes you're in a really intensive monitoring because of your data, and other times you look good because your data is of good quality. We don't want you ending up in a really targeted, intensive monitoring cycle because of bad data, which is oftentimes what we see. Okay, so you need to make sure that you pay attention to the reports that you're certifying this year, because it's going to affect your monitoring determination for next year. Also, many of you probably were asked when the annual determination letters went out this year based on the prior year data, your directors were probably asking you, what in the heck? There was something called a timeline compliance section, and it was the counts of kids that had late annual IEPs, counts of kids that had late reevaluations and initial evaluations. Where did that come from, right? What's going on here? Because those counts this year were very high. So you may not know what the annual performance report is, but your directors are asking you because the annual determination letters are showing counts that are coming directly from CALPADS. So we're going to cover that again today. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the term ODS. So how many of you are familiar with that term, ODS, Operational Data Store? Okay, what does it mean? Okay, so it's all of the data. But what's important about Operational Data Store, and anytime you hear me say ODS report, please understand that that report reflects the most current data that you're submitting. Okay, some of the ODS reports that we provide you for special education purposes are refreshed multiple times a day. And so they become really powerful tools for you to use. But understand that those reports are using what's currently in the database, as opposed to a snapshot report. A snapshot report is looking at a set of data based on one day, like Census Day, or in the case of end of year, it's looking at a span of data and a date range. Okay, and then once you create a revision, that revision freezes and you certify it. Okay, so that's a picture of your end of year data versus the ODS, which can change every single day, multiple times a day. Okay, and I believe that most of you are probably familiar with the rest of these terms, but they're there for your reference just in case you need them. CSIS right now is conducting end of year 4 trainings. So end of year trainings. Have any of you been to those trainings yet? Okay. So here's the difference between that training and this training, because many SPED data coordinators, they don't have access to go to those CSIS trainings because you don't have bridge accounts, right? And you're like, why can't I get into those trainings? Well, bottom line is you can, but you need to work with your CALPADS administrator. And she's like, I don't want to go to that training. That's why I'm here. You can attend the CSIS training, but you need to log in under your CALPADS administrator's bridge account. You have to work with them, and you can attend the training under their bridge account. The difference is CSIS focuses primarily on the how-to, right? How to get files up there, what errors to look for, What are some milestones and timelines that you need to set for your LEA? How to get certified. Whereas this really focuses on special education program related content. So we're going to explain the why. Why are you doing this? All right, so let's talk about IEP implementation. There's a, oh man. So your SELPA directors received access to the IEP implementation data collection yesterday. They should have received their access codes. And this is going to be done annually, every single year. Okay. So why do we collect data on IEP implementation? Well, first of all, we're required to. So IDEA requires the state of California to monitor districts and their implementation of IEPs and plans within a district. So what percentage of services is a student receiving? Because what is the threshold? What percentage do you think the U.S. Department of Education requires that you meet in terms of percentage of services received in an IEP? At least 95, 100%. That's the threshold. That's the target. They're expecting that districts are going to provide 100% of services that are prescribed in the IEPs. And so the state of California has to monitor that. Now, the intent is not to identify issues with specific students. It's to identify systemic issues that may exist in the district that are preventing students from receiving the services within their IEPs. And if we do identify systemic issues, then the Department of Education can provide help and resources to sort of drill down to the root causes of that. And then we ask you to take a look at those IEPs and categorize students in one of three ranges, which I will talk about in a second. So here's a little bit about the procedure and methodology for IEP implementation. So CDE is going to provide a random sample of statewide student identifiers for students with disabilities to each LEA based on the following criteria. Okay, so if you have 1 to 100 students with disabilities, then you would be required to review 20 to 100% of your IEPs. And there are several ranges all the way up to 5,000 plus, in which case you would be required to review a maximum of 500 IEPs. Okay. Now, small LEAs. Okay. So how many of you are from charter schools? Okay. Were you identified for cyclical monitoring, small LEA monitoring in cycle A, B, or C? Are you aware? Okay. So if you were, you don't have to do this, right? So you don't have to do this year. If you were identified in one of those cycles, that's really, really important. Okay, so if you were a charter or a small district that was not identified in cycles A, B, or C, you will be included in your authorizing district's IEP implementation data collection this year. That's really clear. So if you had 100 or fewer students with disabilities and you were selected in one of those monitoring cycles, you don't have to do this until your actual monitoring cycle. So for you, which cycle were you selected for? Okay, so you won't have to do this again until your next monitoring cycle, okay? Because everybody did it last year. 3, A, B, and C. Okay. Also, so that for the large LEAs, your student sample is going to exclude all of your small LEAs that were selected in one of those monitoring cycles. So let's just say Sonoma County, for example, has charters or small LEAs within there, and those are now excluded because they're in a monitoring cycle. Your number of IEP reviews is going to depend on the residual number of students. Okay, so they should have provided you, oops, sorry about that. They should have provided you a student sample based on that residual number of students after the small LEAs were removed. Does that make sense? Okay. So when you're reviewing students' IEPs, they're gonna drop into one of three ranges. So 100 to 95% of their services were implemented, 94.9 to 90%, or less than 90%. So based on the data last year, because everybody did this collection last year, how many of you had a majority of your kids drop into that bottom tier? Okay, so talk about maybe some of the reasons why. Truancy issues. Right, so you had to include student absences. So we're going to address that. What about you over here? Testing window. Okay, so we're going to clarify some of these things because how many of you attended the IEP implementation webinar that I did? I'm sorry. Okay. It was the worst webinar I've ever done in my whole entire life. And I've done some doozies, but I just wasn't prepared for a lot of the questions. And so since then, we've kind of talked internally and tried to really clearly outline and clarify some of these things. This is what caused the most angst. Okay, what does my numerator have to include when you're trying to figure out a percentage? And what does the denominator have to include? Now, you're not going to like a lot of what I'm going to say. Okay, I'm just going to be really clear about that. But when you're looking at obstacles and barriers to IEP implementation, everything that is preventing a student from getting their services that can be addressed by the district should be included in the denominator. Okay, so let's talk about the numerator first of all. It's actual services received. So how many minutes based on the prescribed minutes did the student actually receive? The denominator needs to include all the prescribed minutes from the IEP, the most recent IEP that you have parent signature on or that the parent has agreed to. And that includes not only the services they received, but it also includes student absences due to illness or familial illness, any truancy, excused or unexcused, and it also includes staff absences due to illness or staff shortages. Okay? But you can exclude field trips, right? Because we're talking about including students with disabilities in these activities that their peers typically participate in. So field trips, scheduled school breaks, such as intercession or spring break, statewide testing periods, student benchmark testing, special programming at the site, like school assemblies, and then school-related emergencies. All of those periods of time can be excluded from the denominator, but you do have to include student and staff absences. So inevitably, the next question is this: why are you doing that, CDE? Because you're already monitoring us for chronic absenteeism on the dashboard. Let me ask you this: how many of you are high school districts only? None. Okay, well, high school districts only are not monitored for chronic absenteeism. But again, state of California is required to monitor what percentage of IEP services are being implemented at every district. And in some cases, chronic absenteeism plays a part in students who are not getting their services. So again, we're only looking at your student sample as a whole. It's a random sample of SSIDs that are chosen. And if a large percentage, a significant percentage of those students are falling in that bottom tier, then we're going to ask you to dig a little deeper and tell us why. Yes. Yeah. So for those of you on the Zoom, she's basically saying that depending on the frequency that you select for each service, how do you figure out what to exclude, the service minutes to exclude, And what I would ask you to do is, so Sherry, have you trained on that, and how basically do you take a yearly service and divide that into 180 days? Okay. Yes. Did you say section-based? Session-based services. Well, we're not providing really explicit guidance on that. What I would urge you to do is to contact Heather DeFeedy, who's part of the IEP implementation improvement, to find out what recommendations she's made with respect to that frequency of service and how you would figure out the total minutes and how to exclude and include specific service minutes. Yes. Okay, so our testing window opens on May 1st and goes through the end of school. You have to look at individual students. So if the student is going through testing during those specific days, so, 1 week, they're doing smarter balance testing. Yes. Okay, sample window ended April 29th, so it may not affect. Yes, that's correct. Yes, you're right. Okay. Thank you for pointing that out. Right. So the period for evaluation, which I'll talk about in a second, is from March 1st through April 29th. So if you've got testing that's going on after that, doesn't really matter because you're looking at the evaluation period between March 1st and April 29th. Okay. So here is an example of the procedure and methodology of how you would figure it out for one particular student. So in this case, a sample LEA it's a large LEA, 5,000 plus students. They would have to review 500 IEPs. So the calculation for a single student, again, the time period for analysis, you're looking at IEPs and students that were continuously enrolled between March 1st and April 29th. Okay. Because now we're May 2nd, and we've already pulled those SSIDs, they've already been provided. One of the things I want to remind you of is CALPADS administrators, hopefully you've exited kids on a frequent basis, okay? Because there is the possibility that in your student samples, you're going to see kids who left and transferred out because they weren't exited in CALPADS. Okay, so if you find those kids, you do not have to review their IEPs. Okay, but the expectation is we're not seeing a huge number of your samples. So if you were supposed to review, let's say 50 IEPs, and 20 to 30 of those kids transferred out during that window of time, then we may send you additional SSIDs to review. We don't want significant percentages of those kids transferred out. Yes. So is there documentation, CALPADS documentation on how often enrollments should be updated? Yes. So the SSID enrollment procedures document has been up since the inception of CALPADS. And for those of you, how many of you have been around since the beginning of CALPADS? Oh man. Okay, there are a couple of you. All right. Any idea? So any idea what the guidance is? Okay, so she does it twice a week, and then it depends on the size of the district. Our guidance is, right, so it fluctuates depending on how busy you are throughout the year. The guidance typically, and what's written in the SSID enrollment procedures, is 14 days after a student enrolls or exits, you should be updating that. So every 2 weeks. But that was when we first launched the system, okay? Waiting 2 weeks is way too long. At least once a week, at least. And many CALPADS administrators do it every single day. Okay, they submit up enrollments and exits. Okay, so, but our guidance is 2 weeks, or at least that's what's written right now. Okay, so time period for analysis, March 1st through April 29th. We're assuming those students were continuously enrolled based on the student sample we provided you, because that's what was showing up in CALPADS. Yes, that's okay. Yes. So if a student that is in that list exited during that time period, remove them from your sample. You do not, well, use your judgment, right? But if they exited during that period, then you can remove them from your sample. You don't have to review that IEP. Okay. All right. So in this case, this student, there was 2,000 service minutes provided. 2,160 minutes were prescribed for that student. So that student falls in the 93rd percentile, which is range B. The IEP implementation timeline. So we already talked about the evaluation period, the date range for IEP review. Training webinar. I told you about that disastrous training webinar, and I told you I was going to post it, but no, I'm not posting that one. I did just somebody's going to post it on YouTube just to make my life miserable. But I did re-record it on Monday, and so we've sent it over for posting. So I'm hoping within the next week. But it does cover a lot of the content that I'm talking to you about today. Your access codes were sent to your CELPA. So your CELPA downloaded those access codes and will provide them out to each of your districts. Okay, so it's really important that if you lose it, if you can't find your access code, who do you contact? CELPA. If you send a message to CDE, oh, sorry about that. Let me mute my computer real quickly. Sorry about that. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So your access codes will be distributed by your CELPA. The data collection window runs May 1st through June 28th, and the final deadline is June 28th. Okay. Did any of you receive our IEP implementation follow-up survey? This probably about 4 or 5 months ago. It was a follow-up survey that was sent out to some districts. Okay. So 10% of LEAs that submit the IEP implementation data collection will receive a follow-up survey. And you may think, oh God, they're making us submit something else. But literally it takes 2 minutes to complete. It's 4 questions. And all it is what is the process that you used to determine the IEP implementation percentage for a single student? What is the process? Is it documented somewhere? Is it electronic? Is it on paper? What are the things that you considered when figuring out whether or not a student received their service? But literally it takes about 2 minutes. Yes. So was it sent directly to the district? Yes, but CELPAs were notified. Right, CELPA was aware of it as well. Yeah, it wasn't very many. So, it's only 10% of all of the LEAs that had to do this IEP implementation data collection. So just be aware that in a couple months, some of you may get this survey. Literally, it takes 2 minutes to complete. Just get it back, and then we provide those data to our focused monitoring and technical assistance teams. Okay, so we're going to talk about any other questions about IEP implementation before I move on. All right, 1621, late plan reviews and reevaluations. So what I would like you to do, for those of you that have laptops, if you are logged into CALPADS, please do so right now. And I'm going to show you how to get into this report. Okay. So here in CalPads, we have the left-hand navigation, and actually, let me reshare. For those of you on Zoom, hopefully you're seeing this. And
Yes,
anybody that's monitoring, Milo, if you're not seeing the screen, could you just let me know?
Yeah, I can see it.
So what we're going to do is look here at accountability monitoring reports. Okay, and then you should see 1621. So there's a SELPA version of this report as well. You're seeing it? Okay, perfect. And what you want to do is click on that link. All right. So for those of you that got annual determination letters, and we talked about that timeline compliance section. So how many of your directors actually reached out to you and said, hey, can you run a report in CalPads and find out who these kids are? So you got that issue. Was it a number that was significantly higher than what you were expecting? Okay, so she wasn't monitoring it, but typically it was, you know, it looked a little high. All right, so the annual determinations, the letter that went out, basically looked at kids who were enrolled on census day, and then whose plans were late as of February 13th, 2024. Okay. And we pulled the data on March 1st. Okay, so based on what was in CalPads, and 1621 is one of those ODS reports I was talking about. This report gets updated every single day, multiple times a day, depending on how often your CalPads administrator submits up enrollments, because this is enrollment driven. Okay, so you'll see that as of date on the report. That as of date is a representation of students that were in your district that were enrolled as of this date, whose plans and their associated monitoring category as of May 2nd. So if we ran this today, we would find out kids who are enrolled in your district based on the enrollments in CalPads and what their specific monitoring category was. Okay, so if I wanted to find out what kids were enrolled on census day, what would the as of date be? October 4th. Okay, so if I wanted to see which kids were enrolled, I would change this to October 4th and I could run the report. And some of you can do it. I can't do it because there's student level data in here. But if you wanted to run that report to find out your kids that were enrolled on census day, you could do that. Now, having said that, I just told you that the annual determinations included kids whose plans were late as of February 13th. Okay, so what you also need to do is you would need to change the as of date here to February 13th and run that report. Okay, so to find the students who were included in the annual determination letter, you have to basically compare those two reports. You're looking for students on the February 13th report that were enrolled on census day. So any kid on the census day report that also appears on the February 13th report, and these are the monitoring categories that you're looking for. It's all of the overdue categories. So overdue plan review, pending record, overdue plan review, no pending record, overdue reevaluation with pending and without pending records. Okay, those are the kids that were included in your annual determination letters on March 1st. Now, having said that, if you go ahead and do that comparison right now, is it going to look the same? Why not? Exactly, right? Remember, this is an ODS report. So if you tried to run this right now, it's not going to look the same as what was in the annual determination letter because everybody got those numbers and was like, what the heck is going on here? Why do I show so many overdues? Because did it look like that in SACE? No, it didn't look like that in SACE. So you guys started submitting up the necessary data to take care of those because a lot of those kids actually had their meetings. And now that report might look really different. That's a good thing because it means as long as every kid had a timely IEP, when we re-pull the data in August, you're going to be good. Okay. So if you want to find the kids in those annual determination letters and make sure they're all timely, then you could do that. Now, one of the things I want to tell you is when you run this report, I strongly urge you not to use these filters to filter out for only certain monitoring categories. You want to run the report without those filters. And when you run the report, and again, I can't do it because it'll show you student level data. When you run the report, you should see this little disk icon. Does everybody see the little disk icon? Okay. Please never download the Excel version of this document. Okay, those of you that have done it before, it looks really pretty, right? But you can't filter, you can't sort because of all the merged cells. So anytime you download this, use the comma delimited CSV version of the report. Okay, there's a little icon. So what you're going to see when you download it is something that looks like this. Okay. All right. So if I do that comparison between the October 4th and the February 13th version, and I'm looking on the February 13th report for their monitoring category. Okay, so I'm just going to do this. All right. So I'm looking for anybody with a monitoring category of overdue, as I told you. And of course, I probably missed it. You. Why am I missing? There it is. Okay. So monitoring category. All right. So let's say I just want to look at my overdues. I can go up to the data tab and I can hit this little filter. And I can look for only my overdues in this file. Okay. So yes. So you can do that. You can run that compliant, non-compliant filter, but I would strongly urge you just to download it because this is not the only use for this report. And I will show you what we're going to do in just a second. Okay, but first utilization of this report is to figure out kids that were in the annual determination letter. Okay, so when let's say I did that comparison, I found the kids that were enrolled on census day who were still enrolled on February 13th, and these were my kids that were overdue. Does it mean that all these kids are overdue? No. What could be causing this? Okay, date error in the IEP. What's some other reasons? Okay, there's a data problem, and I heard over here they're not sending the files up. Okay, what does it take in SACE to get files sent up to CALPADS? What do case managers have to do typically? Affirm. They're not affirming those IEPs. And so that affirmation process is literally, it means save. That's what it means. They're not saving that record because that's been historical practice. But with SPED redesign, that is the only way a transaction comes up from SACE to CALPADS. So if they're not doing that, you're not getting credit for the meeting that you held because the data are not in CALPADS. So it doesn't mean that the meeting didn't get held. It might have been held. It's just that the record is not in here. Okay, so you need to work with your case managers. Now, initial evaluations are a little bit different, but for plan reviews and for reevaluations, affirming those right away will get a meeting sent up to CALPADS, and then you don't have to worry about this. Okay, so you want to review each of these overdues, look in the IEP, and see if the meeting was held. Yes, Sherry. She just covered all the content on one of my slides, by the way. Okay, go ahead, Sherry. Right. So Sherry was just basically saying that there's a few reasons, which I'll cover in a second, why these kids are showing up as overdue. And do you really want to put your focus on these overdue plan reviews and reevaluations in this report right now? Because you've got all of the other end of year stuff to worry about. And I would agree with that. I would agree with that right now. You don't have to necessarily focus on this. It's going to become important when we pull the data for timeline compliance for next year, right? Which will be done at the initial certification deadline for fall 1. That's when we're going to pull it. So I'll talk about that in a little while. But you're right. But if you wanted to use this report on a regular basis, and again, I just showed you or kind of talked about how to utilize it to find out the kids that are included in your annual determination letter timeline compliance section. But there are some other uses for this particular report. So this speaks to the timeline compliance and how you could find those students. There's detailed instructions on these slides about how to do that comparison. And Dominic Johnson is going to work with me to kind of put together some tutorials for you guys on how to do something called a VLOOKUP. How many of you guys do VLOOKUPs? Okay, so VLOOKUPs are basically a ways to compare two lists and find similarities or differences between those two lists. Okay, so he's going to work with me on putting some tutorials together for you guys so that you can easily do something like that. Now, here's the Sherry slide. This is what this is the reason that many of these things are showing up as overdue. Okay, the first and foremost, you're going to hear me say this a million times today. E155 and E156. How many know what those mean? Okay, what does it mean? They exited, but they were expected to come back the next year. Okay, so if they're expected to return the next year and they don't, from the special education side, your district still has a responsibility because we don't know what happened to that kid. You still have a responsibility. Furthermore, on the attendance side of things, you have a responsibility. Your supervisors of attendance and their staff are required to do comprehensive investigations to find out what happened to kids. So those of you that are CALPADS administrators, you should be looking at your exit reason discrepancy reports for your E155s and E156 because it has implications for special education. You should be updating those. Some of those kids moved out of state, left to another country. They moved to private schools. Some of them, so they're gone. But updating that exit code is going to remove them from 1621. So having said that, if your CALPADS administrator doesn't want to do that, you can also send up a status record of eligible, not enrolled. If you send that status record up to CALPADS, those students will drop off the reports. Okay. Students who are exited from special education. So how many times you guys get transfers into your district where they're no longer on IEPs, but the other district did not exit them? Okay, so how are you handling that now? Okay, so she says that when she gets transferring kids and there's an indication that they are no longer eligible, they were not eligible after reevaluation, or they were exited for some other reason, she just doesn't adopt the record and it stays in the system as pending. Okay, so yes. Right. So she's asking the other district to do it. You don't have to do that anymore. You can do it yourself. You can send up a status of eligible not participating, eligible not enrolled, or not eligible, even if the other district made that determination. You don't have to wait for them anymore, because anytime you're sending up a status of anything but eligible and participating, okay? If you send up a status of eligible and participating, you're telling us that that kid is eligible and receiving services at your district. But all of the others, eligible, not enrolled, eligible, not participating, or not eligible, if the other district did not exit them, you can send up that status for them. Now, if you don't want to do that, that's totally up to you, but the student will persist on your 1621. So you're the one that's on the hook. Yes. So should we get SACE to send it up, or should we go into online maintenance and enter it in CALPADS? You should go into online maintenance and enter the record. Okay. CSIS, yes. I'm sorry? Okay, so she's saying, what if they exited not during my enrollment period? Isn't CalPADS going to give me an error? No. Okay, we don't require overlapping enrollments for any of the statuses you see in this second bullet here. For 2, 3, or 4, you don't need an overlapping enrollment. And it was by design that we did that, because this was a problem with the prior model. You know, kids were coming to you from other districts. The district didn't get that record up into CalPADS. They were exited, and there was no way you could fix it unless you contacted the other district, and they would have to send up that transaction, modify the transaction, and send it up. And 9 times out of 10, they wouldn't do it, right? So now you don't have to wait for them. It does not have to overlap your enrollment period. Now, the last reason those records are also not in there, and we also talked about case managers not affirming meetings, but the last bullet here is we did not catch everything. When we did data creation for the SPED redesign, there were some meetings that we missed, okay, and did not make it into the system. If they're not in there, you can go into online maintenance and just enter them, and it gets kids off this list. Okay? Yes. Oh, we'll talk about that. Yeah. Didn't get up there. Yeah. Right. So kid transferred in. It looked like, based on the information in SACE, that a transaction had been posted and accepted by CalPADS. But when you looked in CalPADS, it wasn't in there. So what's going on? So we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. So bear with me. All right. So let's see here. Okay.
Hey, Brandy.
With respect to the annual determination letters, as I told you, after we certify end of year, which the deadline is August 16th, we're going to be pulling another set of data for the timeline compliance. As long as all of the kids, if you do that comparison, as long as all of the kids show timely or they have valid meeting delays, then you're all good. You don't have to worry about anything. All right, so let's say we want to run that report 1621 to find students who are currently late. So if you wanted to find out who's overdue as of today, whose meetings are overdue as of today, you could run that report with the date of May 2nd, as I told you. And the other thing that you want to look for in that particular report, by the way, folks, is meeting delays, okay? So here are the ones that are overdue, which means that basically the most recent record in CalPADS is saying that the student is overdue. So you need to do an investigation. You need to compare with SACE. But there is another monitoring category, a couple other ones that I want you to pay attention to. And those are plan review held late and reevaluation held late. So if I run these, essentially it's saying the meeting was held, but it was held late. So if a meeting was held late, what does CDE expect from you guys? A delay code. And it has to be a valid, well, it doesn't have to, it's not always, but we expect a delay code. So another thing to check in this report, specifically for kids that are showing up on your current reports, is whether or not there is an appropriate meeting delay. And you'll see here, this is, yes. Oh, Milo's trying to get my attention. All right. It's because I probably turned down my volume.
Oh, yeah, Dominic
Milo.
tried earlier. No, that's okay. I just wanted to let everyone know that Dominic posted a link to the VLOOKUP tutorial. So you can find that in the chat, which would be really helpful in
Yes. So
comparing
there
the
was
files.
a VLOOKUP. And for those of you that are here in the room, we can provide that information to you. Yes. Awesome. Right. So the VLOOKUP that was from someone in, I believe, Orange County. And she uses it to do a comparison between her SACE system and her student information system. But you can use VLOOKUP for lots of different things, including the annual determinations. So here, if we look at those meetings that were held late, we expect a meeting delay code. But as you can see here, there are several that are blank. Okay, the ones that are blank are essentially non-compliant. Okay, so you want to make sure that you check these transactions in SACE, modify the meeting delay code within that transaction, and resend it up so that you have your meeting delay appropriately reflected. Okay, so 2 different ways that you can use that report. Now, the other way that you can use the report, so if I go ahead and I take off all my filters here, so I'm going to remove the monitoring category, and this is the reason that you want to download this file in its entirety. Okay, so you'll notice here that there's a record here that doesn't quite fit. El Dorado County Charter SELPA, but I ran this for Sonoma. So why is that student showing up on my list? Okay, so the DSEA has another district listed. Okay, what are some other reasons? There we go. Go ahead, I'm sorry. They enrolled. Okay, so they just transferred in. So how many times have we heard, well, this kid enrolled and they were enrolled for 2 months and the parent didn't tell us they were on an IEP when they enrolled? Okay, those days are gone, folks, because CALPADS tells you. This is how they tell you. Your CALPADS administrator submits up an enrollment for the student. That student at the prior district has an IEP. Or they could be coming from another district of location where they were on an ISP, right? And now they're coming into your district. CALPADS is telling you this kid is on an active plan. They just transferred into your district. So 1621 can be used to find those kids. So what does this mean? When you see another kid here, what do you have to do in SACE? Go request the record. Or if they're coming from a non-SACE district, or, yes, exactly. Or if they're coming from out of state and they're on an active IEP, they're returning to California, then you could enter in a record with their written IEP. But basically it's telling you your 30-day window for an interim starts now. Okay. How often can you take a look at this report? Every day, multiple times a day. Okay. CALPADS administrators, I know that you said you submit up enrollments twice a week. Do you typically do it on the same day? Every Thursday. Okay. Every Thursday. I'm hearing Thursdays. So as a SPED coordinator, once those enrollments are posted to CALPADS, I could go in the following day. The point is you have to coordinate. You have to reach out and you have to find out when they're submitting enrollments and then go in the next day and take a look at this, because then you won't have that issue where parents are not disclosing that the kid's on an IEP. And then many of them come in with late meetings already, right? And you want to get those taken care of. So you need to utilize this report. You no longer have to use the SSID extract. We told you that last year. Use the SSID extract. They don't have to do that anymore, right? They can use this report and they can run it every single day. Now, having said that, is there any SPED coordinator in here that doesn't have access to this? Because if you don't have access to this and your CalPADS admins don't want to give you access, that's a problem, because this report was designed specifically for you guys. So make sure that your CalPADS admin gives you access to this report. It's not, but just send me, it kind of goes without saying, just say, I'm going to tell Brandy that we don't have access to this report. Right. Right. No, I totally get it. But if you are having issues and they're apprehensive about giving you access, please feel free to reach out. I mean, and first to your SELPA, obviously, but feel free to reach out to the department if that is not working. Okay. So do we have a more comprehensive understanding of Report 1621 now? Okay. Because yes, that's okay. What about the late initials and which one? And transregs, right? So the transition goals. Okay, I'm going to cover those ad nauseum a little later when we get to the report section. So what about the transition goals and the late initials? And by the way, I just have to tell you, just as the late initial report is very likely not going to make it in this year, but we are not going to be pulling those data for compliance purposes for the annual determination letters until fall. However, they are used in your indicators or federal indicators for this end of this year, but I'm going to teach you a trick on how to utilize 1621 to find those kids. So I'll show you. All right, so let's get into preparing for end of year. So here are our deadlines. Certification deadline, the initial one is July 26th. It's for all of the end of year submissions. And August 16th is when the amendment window closes. So do we use the data on July 27th that you're certifying for any reason? So the answer is no, we don't use it. So why do we have that initial certification deadline? Any idea? So you have time to make changes. It's something that we figured out. If we don't give you an initial certification deadline, many districts wait until 1 to 2 weeks before the final amendment window to even start looking at their data. And as most of you know, it takes a lot longer than that. Okay, so ideally you want to get to LEA approval by July 27th so that you give your SELPAs plenty of time, 3 to 4 weeks, to look at those reports to make sure that they're accurate, because your SELPAs have to certify. Now, having said that, also, let's take a look at this window of time, July 27th through August 16th. What typically happens during that period during the year? Well, the New Year's setting up, but mostly it's like, aloha oi. Vacation. Everybody's gone. Your case managers are gone. Your administrators are gone. So having said that, we're going to go through some activities that your case managers need to go through in SACE before the end of the school year or shortly after the school year ends, before they leave. Also, communicating to your administrators that they have to, key staff have to be available during this period because you need them to review the data. Okay. And, you know, we have been communicating that out to your administrators as well. You have to make key staff available during those times because they have to review those reports. So here's an example of an end of year and cohort internal timeline that was provided by Fresno County Superintendent of Schools. So how many of you actually have a documented timeline for data reporting? End of year. Anybody have an end of year calendar? Okay, perfect. And how's that worked for you? So okay, so it identifies the people that need to do the reviews, You make appointments, you meet with the principals to kind of go over the data for each of their sites. What are some of the other things that are on those calendars? Okay. Testing windows? Okay. So you have a calendar for yourself, right? Okay. So what's really clear is you lay out all of the activities and you identify milestones. And the CSIS end of year training, by the way, has a really great milestone calendar that you could use. By this date, and July 12th is what they're recommending. So by July 12th, have your data in really good shape so that you can get it to LEA approved status by July 26th. And then your CELPAs have until August 16th to go ahead and certify those data. And again, what's really important, although it may not be transparent to all of you special education data coordinators, is again, the data you're certifying now is used in your monitoring determinations for next year. That's why it's really important that your administrators take a look at those reports as well. All right, so what are you certifying in end of year 4? We're looking July 1st through June 30th, all students that were eligible and participating for special education at some point during an enrollment period at your district. Okay? And that includes kids who are on ISPs, IEPs, IFSPs. It also includes students who were initially evaluated, but they were eligible, not participating because the parent declined the offer of FAPE, or they were not eligible. They were determined to be ineligible. You're also certifying kids who exit the special education program at any point during the year. And then finally, your post-secondary data. So how many of you have sent out your surveys for your kids from last year? Okay, good. So you're required to enter in their outcomes if you've heard from them. And even in some cases, if you haven't, you're certifying those post-secondary outcomes for the prior year cohort, 22, 23. Yes. Yeah, we call. Right. So we call them because we get a better response. The survey and how you conduct the survey is totally up to you. Okay? But you are required to identify all of those students and reach out to them. Now, end of year 3, specifically for students with disabilities, we're focused on incident reporting for students with disabilities. And you're looking at any student with disability who had an incident between July 1st and June 30th of the academic year. And it was an offense involving education codes 48900 through 48915, which are suspendable and expellable offenses, but it doesn't mean the student actually has to have been suspended or expelled. Just the incident had to involve one of those ed codes. Also, incidents of physical, mechanical restraint, or seclusion, that's also included in the end of year 3, even if it wasn't affiliated with an ed code violation. Okay, so we're gonna talk about that a little later. All right, so Dominic, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so if I'm saying anything incorrectly, can you just chime in?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is typically his section because he was with me on the other road shows. But these are some of the things that you want your case managers to take care of or your special education data coordinators to take care of before school ends, before your case managers leave. Okay. If you do all of this and get all of this done before you submit or before you even start looking at the errors in CALPADS, before you start looking at reports, your data will be in really good shape. Okay, so before the submission window opens and school ends, one of the first things, SACE has many queries, searches that you guys can run on a regular basis. Now, whether or not you actually run those searches for data quality is totally up to you, but your vendor has provided you some of those searches. And what you should specifically be looking at is your least restrictive environment fields. What's their setting code? Okay, making sure that that's accurate. Looking at your parent involvement. Did the parent feel that they were involved in the IEP process? There's a search within SACE that'll show you that information. The last and next plan review and reevaluation dates, because sometimes if those dates are incorrect, then you'll end up holding meetings late because those dates were incorrect. Parent consent dates for pending students. So what was the date that the parent consented to the initial evaluation. And then finally, your transition indicators. So your trans reg, right? You need to make sure that those are populated for any students that are 16 years or older. You should start doing it when they're 15. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Okay, next, we talked about this. Make sure your case managers have affirmed or saved all of their IEPs and amendments, even in cases where the parent has not yet signed the IEP. The only exception I know in SACE is initial evaluations. SACE doesn't recommend that you affirm those until after the parent has signed. Now, what can you do though? If you've held the initial evaluation meeting, parent hasn't yet signed the IEP, what can you do? Go into online maintenance and you can enter the meeting if you want that meeting to show up. Okay, now when the parent finally does sign the IEP, SACE is going to generate a transaction. You can send that transaction up there. If the dates are exactly the same on that meeting, if all the information is the same, it just replaces whatever's in there, right? It just either ignores it, but it's essentially the same record. Okay, but if you want to get it up there in a more timely manner because the parent has not signed and they're taking their time, you can reflect that meeting in CALPADS by going into online maintenance. Yes. So are we going to get a CALPADS error? If the meeting date is the same, all of the data match, no, you will not get an error. It basically just replaces the record. That's all. All right, so just make sure that they are affirming all of these IEPs, amendments before they leave for school. Don't leave anything open. Okay, take care of your students marked as do not report. Many of you put them in that DNR, those transactions in DNR. Why? Because there's an error, because I can't get the file up there. So I'm gonna do not report this because it's causing a fatal input error and I can't get any of my kids up there. So you move them into that parking lot, but you can't leave them in the parking lot, which we know has happened. Okay, so if you leave kids in that DNR and it is a reportable transaction. So by reportable transaction, I mean, this is an event that took place between 7/1 and 6/30. That includes initials, plan reviews, reevaluations, amendments, exits. Any of those things that took place between those dates is a reportable transaction. So make sure that your case managers are taking care, or your SPED data coordinators are taking care of the do not report transactions. Because otherwise, it could potentially affect funding later on down the line. You want those kids to be included in your child counts. All right, make sure kids are properly exited. So there are specific fields in SACE that you have to populate to appropriately exit a kid. So if you see exit dates, but you don't see the exit reason, or some of those other fields are not populated, make sure all of those things that are necessary to get that exit transaction sent up are populated in SACE. And you can run a search within SACE to find where those data are missing. Make sure you review the SSID and local ID fields. This is a common problem, apparently, in SACE. You're not populating the SSID or you don't have the local ID. If you don't have those, the record cannot go up to CALPADS. So SACE provides a search so that you can take a look to see whether or not those fields need to be populated within your systems. Also keep in mind that you also have to have enrollments in certain situations. So again, I told you, anytime you're sending up a status record that says I'm eligible and participating, or any plan record, any IEP information, if you're sending up that plan, it means you are actually serving the student, or service records, because those are directly affiliated with plans. Okay, so you must have an overlapping enrollment for those 3 types of records in those cases. Otherwise, you're going to get the GR 5, right? Right, which means you don't have ownership of this kid. All right, transition services. Make sure you're running that search to verify that every student 16 and older has those 8 transition questions answered. Okay, if they're 16 or older, it has to be yes or no. It should not be blank. Okay, so I'm going to show you where to find that in CALPADS and how you can verify that. But any transition responses that are answered no and that was wrong, they have to be fixed via amendment. All right, so just make sure your case managers are aware of that. And then also start identifying your kids that are 15 that are going to need these transition goals. Be proactive and start thinking about holding those transition meetings for those kids. Make sure you're reviewing all data for your kids that are in NPS schools, non-public schools. Verify the school of attendance, primary residence category, the percent of time in general education. This is really important, particularly for next year. Their program setting, service provider, and service location. All right, compare what's in SACE against what is in your student information system. So what student information system do you guys use? You guys are all on Aries. Do you have automatic integration? You have what? Oh, you have Alma. You have one of the new ones. Oh, you love Alma. Okay. Do they have integration between SACE? Okay. Anybody else have integration? How's that work for you? Okay. So there isn't any documentation, but it is. And is it two-way integration or one-way? Okay, two-way, which means if there's records in SACE, it will tell Aries that the student is a student with disabilities. So talk to Alma about this, because this is actually, it's a really good opportunity for that, because they're brand new. Okay, yeah. So doing that comparison on a regular basis means that your systems are consistent. They're always showing the same group of kids. All right. So if you don't have integration, if you don't have that automatic integration, Dominic talked about that VLOOKUP tool that was provided by the woman in Orange County. She has to use that because they don't have automatic integration. So if you download a file from SACE, you download a file from Aries, and you use the VLOOKUP to compare them, you can find kids that are in one system and not the other. So if a student's exited from special education, make sure that they're not showing up as a student with disabilities in your student information system. And if preschoolers or private school students have exited, make sure their CALPADS enrollment is also exited, particularly if they're not in a preschool program. Many of your preschool age students are only receiving services. So make sure that their enrollment exits are in the enrollment system. Okay, pending meeting types. Meeting type 30. When do you guys create meeting type 30s in SACE? Okay, parental consent is received for initial evaluation for the student. And so you create this pending initial evaluation. Typically, SACE will generate this transaction, and then you have to send the transaction up to CALPADS to say that we've received parental consent, the initial evaluation is pending. When you're creating these records, you need to make sure that the referral date is in there, the referring party, meeting type 30, plan type 30. If meetings have been held for these students, then generate the transaction with the appropriate outcome of the initial evaluation. But also, if parents revoked consent, you got a pending record in there. Parent revoked consent for assessment. What should you do? Delete that pending record, okay? Because as long as you show that a student has parental consent for evaluation, we're holding you to that 60-day timeline. Okay, so you need to make sure to delete it. Yes. None of the case managers create pending records. Mhm. Right. So they're not creating pending records, and they're not getting any transactions created until they affirm, is what I'm hearing. Okay, so what is the problem with that? Why is that practice? Okay, so you get it when you get the referral and you get the signed the parental consent for initial evaluation, you create the pending meeting type. Okay. Okay. So SACE gives you warnings when you've got that parental consent for initial evaluation. It gives you a warning and says, hey, you need to create the meeting type 30 and 300 if they enter the parental consent for evaluation. Okay. They don't enter the date. Okay. So that's problematic. That's problematic for a couple of reasons. The parent consent, the parent, right. So you need that initial parental consent. Yes. Yeah. So it comes from the top down, right? Your administrator says, you got to do this. So, okay. Yes, Sherry. Yeah, it will look different. Right. Right. So if a student had previously been eligible, the parental consent for evaluation dates may be outdated, and it may be triggering that 60 days when it's not actually valid. So I understand that. But in terms of process, these pending records are the only way that CalPADS knows that your 60-day timeline has begun. Okay. And so, particularly if you're not tracking them internally, if they're not entering those dates, you are more prone to not being in compliance once the meetings are actually held, because they may not be held within those 60 days. But SACE can't even tell you that, and CalPADS can't tell you that. Okay, so just make sure that they're reviewing those pending meeting types. I'm going to cover this later on in the presentation, but incidents. You've got incidents for students with disabilities. You're going to need to make sure that you work with the folks that know that those incidents occurred and get them entered into the student information system. Again, we'll cover that a little bit later. Okay, so conducting those post-secondary outcome surveys. Any student that exited in 2023 with one of these enrollment exits or completion status codes should be included in your survey. Okay, I'll talk a little bit later about the report you can use within CalPADS to find out who these kids are, but also SACE can provide you a list of students, although it may not be based on these particular exit codes. Just be aware of that. And more detail on these specific codes can be found in Flash 203. All right, so after school ends, what are the important things right after school ends that you need to be able to make sure is accurate in your special education data system? Make sure you work with your student information system administrator to identify students with disabilities that are either high school graduates or they're completers and they are not returning, okay? Because there's things that you need to do within SACE. You need to exit those students appropriately in SACE in order for your indicators to show up correctly, in order for CalPADS to exclude those kids from things like monitoring reports. Okay, they have to be appropriately exited within SACE. All right, here are some exit codes that may trigger special education exits. So right now, CalPADS administrators, how many of you actually share any of this information with your SPED coordinators? Okay, so there's 1 and 2. So you're both. Okay, well, that's good. But some of these, particularly the transfers to private, transfers out of the US, those are going to have an impact on the status, the student status in SACE. If they transfer out, you need to tell SACE, hey, they're eligible, but they're no longer enrolled because they moved out of state. You have to have that communication between your CalPADS administrator and your SPED data coordinator, because some of these are going to trigger exits, particularly any of the completion statuses, right? If they got an adult ed diploma or certificate of completion, there are things that you may need to do in SACE, not always, but sometimes it's going to affect their status. Okay, and it will affect your reports and your child counts if they're not appropriately updated. Then once you conduct those surveys, you need to make sure that you update the results in SACE. And from what I've heard Dominic say, it's not through the standard process that you usually use to get all those files up there. You have to generate a separate post-secondary report, and you have to send that up separately. Okay, so just make sure that you're sending up results for all students that were identified to be surveyed. And when I say all students, remember, we have 2 responses in there that are refused to answer and could not contact. So every student should have a response, or every student should have a result. Okay, work-based learning programs. So you on the SPED side of the house need to help your SIS folks in identifying students with disabilities who completed at least 100 hours of work experience, paid or unpaid, through either the Workability Program, Department of Rehab Services, or any other local program that you have for students with disabilities to earn work experience. Okay, so if they got 100 hours within grades 9 through 12, and they sat in courses or took courses over the course of grades 9 through 12 that were classroom-based work exploration. What does that look like? Career classes, life skills classes that teach them how to build resumes and do interviews. Okay, so if your students with disabilities meet those 2 criteria, 100 hours over 9-12, 4 semesters, the equivalent of 4 semesters of classroom-based work exploration over grades 9 through 12, those kids can be considered prepared in your career college indicator on the dashboard. And I will tell you, this is so important because it's one of the only indicators that specifically includes students with disabilities in this way. If they meet those 2 things and they graduate with a certificate of completion, they can be counted as prepared. So how many of you are doing this right now? Okay, a couple of you. For those that aren't, you have to assist in identifying these kids. We're going to go over the report later, and I'll show you exactly where to look for those kids. Yes. Does a CTE course count as career? Absolutely. Yes. Again, but it's looking at a specific group of kids who are at the end of their cohort year or graduating with a certificate of completion. Those are the kids that we're talking about. All right. Data submission and error resolution, really important. After your case managers do this local audit, you need to make sure the records are in CALPADS. Okay, because we just heard an example of, hey, we sent up the transaction, it says accepted, but it's not in CALPADS. What the heck, CALPADS? Why aren't you showing the data? You need to make sure that you do that. So there was an issue with SACE for transactions from late September, early October, and they were incorrectly marked as accepted by CALPADS. So SACE did a bulk update, and they got most of the records up there, but not all of them. Okay, there were some that did not make it up there. Yes. Okay, March. All right, so yours falls into this next category. There's another unique situation, and it's all because of how your case managers are affirming those IEPs. Okay, so if a case manager erroneously selects yes for a transferred student are they coming from out of state or are they coming from a non-SACE district? If they select yes there, then SACE will not generate a meeting record. They won't generate it because if they're coming from out of state, you're not holding a meeting. You're just adopting that out of state IEP, or you're creating it from a paper document. And they're coming from a non-SACE district. So they use Welligent or Cyrus, something like that. It does not create a meet record. And furthermore, if they say that the parent hasn't signed, later in that process, it's an unsigned IEP, then what SACE is doing is it's creating a blank transaction because they only create plan and serve records when you have parent signature. Okay, so sometimes you'll see a transaction in SACE that says accepted, but there's nothing in it. There's nothing in there. Yes. So who's actually doing this? So Sherry. Right. So there's a couple of, during the affirmation process, there's a couple new questions. And they specifically, is this kid coming from out of state? Is this kid coming from a non-SACE district, or for kids that are transferring to and from private schools? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So for kids that are coming from out of state, those questions in SACE are really geared toward kids who were previously in California, left, and then came back. Whereas you may get some kids from out of state who have never been in California before. So you need to be cognizant of that. But having said that, how do you know when the record's actually been posted in CalPADS or the transaction? Anybody know? When it shows up in CalPADS, yes. But how else could you find out? In SACE. Job ID, not record ID, job ID. Okay, on the transaction, apparently in the little pencil icon, if you click on the pencil icon, there should be a job ID, not only attached to the CalPADS report, but that job ID will appear on each transaction that was included in the CalPADS report. A job ID is something that CalPADS gives SACE and says, hey, we got your data. Here's the job ID. If there is no job ID, it is not in CalPADS. Okay? And it may have been a SACE issue. Yes. Okay, so yeah. So she says all these transactions were submitted by another district and the meet file didn't get created. It's because of that it's because the case manager made the wrong selections. I guarantee it. Okay, but that's not something you can control. You can actually submit up the status though, unless they were eligible and participating. And if they were, that district has to enter it. Okay. All right. So how about waking up May 7th with no errors, right? How can you do that? Okay, maybe not this year, but look, we have to be looking at the future here, folks. Okay, so what I want all of you to do in CalPADS is we've got our data discrepancy reports, and I want to show you something really cool. So if you go to CalPADS and you open data discrepancies, and you change the certification cycle to end of year 4 and hit apply filters. Okay, we haven't even opened the submission window yet. And here's all the errors that I can resolve. These are special education errors. I can go in there, and again, assuming all your case managers have already done all the cleanup, I can start reviewing all of these errors and cleaning them up even before the submission window opens. So many of you were previously saying, CalPADS, come on, man. Show us the errors before the submission window opens, because May 7th is way too late. And now we've done that, and you guys are saying, wait, why are you showing me all these errors right now? Okay, this is game-changing, folks. Maybe not necessarily for this year, but certainly for fall, and here's why this becomes important. So the really cool thing about this data discrepancy interface is if I change the academic year to next year, and I change, not the district, I change the certification cycle to end of year 1, oops, not end of year 1, fall 1. And I hit apply, this is going to show me all of my errors that are going to cause me to not certify in fall 1. Okay, so this can tell you in the future based on data now. However, if you're going to start looking at data discrepancies for next year, make sure that you don't start doing it until July 1st. This is really important because you want kids to remain in their current settings for this academic year. Don't start cleaning up any of this stuff, holding your transition meetings for kids until, or at least not sending up the data until after July 1st. Okay, so data discrepancies, huge. For fall, this could mean that you guys get certified way ahead of schedule. All right, finding your data discrepancies here, some high frequency ones. SENR 606 E4. If you don't have a plan record for a student, you're going to get this error. They're enrolled in your district. How can you find these kids? How can you find kids that are enrolled, but you haven't adopted their plans? Yes. Yeah, 1621. You won't have 606. It's disabled right now, by the way. So if you go on and you look at 1621 right now, you resolve those, you're not going to have any of these errors. So please do that. Yes. Yes, we are going to enable it. We've just got to make some tweaks to it. So it wasn't triggering correctly for N470s. So we've got to fix that. So look at 1621. 1624 is missing special education status record. So you held a meeting for a kid, an initial. There was an outcome. There had to have been. Maybe the parent hasn't signed yet, which means the student might be eligible not participating from the meeting date up until parent signature. So you can enter an eligible not participating record into CALPADS to get rid of this. But this typically happens when you have unsigned evaluations. So those initials where parents are kind of waiting. So in the interim, as parents are mulling it over, you can go into CALPADS online maintenance, enter in an eligible not participating status for those kids. And that'll get rid of this one. Can you do it for your transition kids when they have their initial transition meeting but the parent hasn't signed? Yes, you can do that too. Plan 637 E4. This caused a lot of headaches. It's disabled right now. But basically this is saying the kid is eligible and participating and there's no enrollment for this kid. These are those E155s. E156, but they were triggering for kids who have been gone now for a year and a half, in some cases 2 years, and they're triggering based on statuses we created for you in the redesign. So looking at your SPED records and looking at their enrollment exits for that prior year, we made a judgment call as to whether or not they were eligible and participating, and some of those kids didn't come back. Okay, so what we're going to do to resolve this is we are going to, for any kid and eligible and participating status that we created, we're going to update that with a subsequent record as of the exit date for the student of eligible not enrolled. That'll take care of about 24,000 of the 35,000 errors. There's still going to be about 10,000 of these when we turn it back on. And that's because your districts submitted up eligible and participating statuses. So you're going to have to resolve it. Okay, so if they're not enrolled, you're going to need to send up a status of eligible, not enrolled. Okay, and then these are your transition indicators. If they are missing for students that are at least 16, you're going to get this error. And we already talked about ways that you can avoid this by doing your local special education audits. But remember, it's looking at the plan that's in CALPADS based on the effective start date of that plan in CALPADS. So if on that plan effective start date, the student was 16, and the record is blank, any of those transition indicators are blank, it means you have to put either a yes or a no in there. So let's get into, a lot of your questions have centered around, where can we look for this? Where can we review XYZ? And I'm going to cover all of that right now. So let's talk about reviewing end of year reports. So again, it's not worth the time or effort to start reviewing any of these reports for end of year until you've done everything that I just talked about. Number one, your local special education audit. Number two, resolve all your fatal data discrepancies, okay? Because those will prevent you from certifying. And if you haven't resolved those, your reports are wrong. I can almost certainly guarantee it. Okay, so once you've done those two things, then start reviewing the reports. Now, what are the end of year data used for? So remember I talked about state performance plan and annual performance reports, SPP, APR. It's used for those indicators. Some of the data are used from end of year are used in specific indicators. So you're going to see references on these slides, and it's not going to mean anything to most of you special education data coordinators, but it's going to mean something to Sherry because she knows what each of those indicators are, or your special education directors. Also, annual determination letters, how you get put into a specific monitoring tier. There's some of the data that's used for annual determinations for 24, 25, and California School Dashboard. Okay, so all data on the California School Dashboard for students with disabilities, some of it actually comes from end of year, specifically the suspension indicator, okay, or your graduation indicator on the dashboard. Now, here's the problem. CALPADS is a data collection system, and that data collection system is based on where the kid goes to school, okay? It's not based on who provides the special education services. It's based on where the kid gets the majority of their instruction and services. So when you're certifying reports in CALPADS, you're certifying them by reporting LEA. The problem is that all of the data for all of those things that I just talked about, SPP, APR, dashboard, as well as your annual determinations, we aggregate the data by something called District of Special Education Accountability. Now, do the reports in CALPADS, are they going to show you all students for whom you are accountable for? No, they don't, okay? It's only showing you the kids for whom you are accountable that are actually attending school in your district, okay? So you have to find out who those kids are. So how do you find out, by the way? Go ahead. DSEA extract. How many of you know what that is? Okay, a couple of you know what it is. Hopefully after today, all of you will use it. We provided 2 extracts. They've been here for 2 years. I know for a fact, now that I'm in this new role with special education, I know that folks aren't looking at these reports because the number one question we got after these annual determinations came out was, who the heck are these kids that are being counted? I don't even, some of these kids, because they did some LEAs requested student lists like the SSIDs, and they're like, this kid doesn't even belong to me. That's because another district said you were the reporting or the District of Special Ed Accountability. Okay, so we're providing you information in CALPADS that tells you that. And if you're not utilizing it, you're doing yourself a disservice because those kids, based on what somebody else is reporting, are going to be counted in your determinations, in your annual performance reports, in the dashboard. Okay, so you need to make sure you understand who those kids are. So there's 2 extracts. One is the accountability, the SEA extract. That extract was designed specifically for the dashboard. Okay, so what it tells you is which kids am I sending accountability to another district? And more importantly, which kids am I receiving accountability for in the dashboard? But it's limited in grade level and enrollment statuses because the dashboard is limited to TK-12, okay? And it does not include charter schools. And the reason it doesn't include charter schools is because on the dashboard, every single charter gets its own indicator. Now, CELPA asked that we create something a little bit different that includes charter schools because sometimes charters are incorrectly identifying the wrong District of Special Education Accountability. So we created something called the Informational DSEA Extract. And what this extract shows you is students with disabilities that are not enrolled in your LEA, but that LEA is saying that you are accountable for them. You have to review this because it is, those kids, if they're not correct, are going to be included in your indicators. So there's a definition of District of Special Education Accountability. There's a link to that. Really important that you read it when identifying who the DSEA is. And then the CALPADS user manual has a full set of documentation on how to get these extracts. Okay, so within CALPADS, if I want to get this extract and I want to find out who these kids are, if you're in CALPADS, run it right now. Okay, so you go to extracts and you'll see over here, DSEA extracts. So I want the informational extract because I just want to know where other LEAs are saying that I'm accountable for the kids that they're serving. And typically what we're talking here, folks, is kids who are referred to through the IEP process to another district. Okay. So you couldn't provide services, but they're receiving services through another district. So you would select informational extract. And your screen, by the way, is going to look a little bit different. You just have to name the file, and then you would hit request file. Okay. So once you request the file, if I go ahead and refresh my screen here, I should see a row that says processing, request received, request processing. Okay, but once that's finished processing, what you should see is a little download button right over here in the actions. It'll allow you to download it. Okay, and when you download it, this is what it looks like. It's like, what the heck is that? What does that mean? Okay, that's terrifying. All right, so how do you make this look like something more palatable? Well, CSIS has provided you in that CALPADS user manual, that link that I showed you, they actually provide you 2 links to templates to import this information into. Okay, so I'll show you the links in just a second. But this is what the template looks like. Okay, it's actually not. So here's the template. This is the template, and all I have to do here is if I scroll over, I've already downloaded my file, right? So if I scroll over and hit import DSEA extract file, and then I find the particular file that I'm looking for, oops, go to my downloads, download a lot of stuff, sorry guys. And I look for this, whoop, there it is. It just imports it, right? And it's going to show me that this is the SSID. This is my district because I'm the one that's running the extract. But more importantly, this is the district that is reporting this kid. Now, you're going to see the same SSID multiple times. And that's probably because this particular district, either the student was enrolled multiple times within that district or they have multiple records within the district. But what you're looking for here is essentially a unique statewide student identifier and a unique district. Who is this district? Make sure that it's correct, because if it's not correct, they're going to show up on all of those reports next year for your district. Any questions? Okay. And so I heard a lot of like, oh, this is a lot of work, like pulling this extract. No, it's okay. I get it. But trust me, you want to take the time to do this because inevitably your SPED director is going to say, who the heck are these kids? Like, why are they showing up in my counts? This doesn't look right. Particularly when you talk about disproportionality and significant disproportionality. If those kids are coming from another district and you don't even serve those kids and it's incorrect, then that throws you into monitoring that you don't want to have to do. Yes. So you want to make sure, so you may not be providing the services, right? They're actually enrolled in another district, but you want to make sure that your district placed them there. So in some cases, you're the district of residence, but they're going somewhere else and they were placed there through the IEP process. Those are the kids that you're looking for. But let's, for example, the parent takes the child and they put them into a charter school. Who becomes the district of special education accountability in that case? The charter, right? But sometimes the charter, here's what we've heard, sometimes the charter will list the district of residence as the DSCA. Not to say they're doing it maliciously, they may just not know, right? So people are not doing this maliciously. Sometimes they just are unaware of when to use the district of residence or not. Yes. Okay, so what about kids that leave your school and go to a private school? So who's responsible for evaluating, for providing services to kids in private schools? Ah, that's a good. All right. So I hear where the kid lives, and that's actually not correct. It's where the private school's located. Yes. Oh, except in Sonoma. Except in Sonoma because you have a special agreement. Okay. Just ignore everything I said if you're in Sonoma County. But typically IDEA regs, that's what the IDEA regulations say, except in Sonoma County. If you develop local agreements, that supersedes IDEA regs. So say that one more time. There's kids that reside in your district. They're attending in Napa County. And in that case, Napa County would be responsible, the district in Napa County. Yes? Yeah. Contact the help, but don't contact Brandy because she will confuse you. No, it's okay. Got it. Okay. Yeah, so if they live somewhere else, but they're in Sonoma County, then yes. So contact Sherry. Yes. It's not always the charter. Yes, you're right. Don't blame it on the charters, Brandy. And yeah, okay. So keep in mind, because I know this is being recorded. Right. Oh, yeah. Actually that's a good point. So if you are what we call at the state level a charter LEA for special education purposes, which means, by the way, that charter has elected to be an individual member of a CELPA, then you are the District of Special Education Accountability. Okay. If a parent elects to send a student, and that's why it's really important. I showed you that link to the definition of DSEA. All the stuff is in there. If you're a charter and the parent elects to send the student to a charter, but you're not a charter LEA for special education purposes, then it's the authorizing district that is the District of Special Education Accountability for that charter. Okay, thanks. All right. So hopefully all of you will go in and take a look at what your DSEA extracts say. Here is the link to the extract document, the templates. Okay, so the template link is in there. It's on the CALPADS user manual. So hopefully you will do that. Now the accountability extract is a little bit different. Like I said, that's going to show you kids that you're receiving accountability for, but also for whom you're sending accountability to. Now here's the important point. If you're receiving accountability and it's wrong, who has to fix it? The other district has to fix it. But if you're sending accountability to somebody and it looks incorrect, you can modify that in SACE and fix it. Okay. Let's talk about changes for reports that you're going to see here in 23-24. So we are adding a new filter to a report called 7.12. Most of you have probably never even looked at 7.12, but I'm going to show you today that you need to. Okay, this is a very important report for you to review. This is the student incident result report. And the reason we're adding this 504 accommodation plan filter is because you may not know this, but your district annually is now required to report counts of restraint and seclusion within your district. And it has to be disaggregated for gen ed, students with disabilities, and students on 504 accommodation plans. So we added this filter to help you verify that. Now, no longer required for end of year 4 certification. And this is permanently. You will not have to certify report 16.13, which is your federal settings report. And you will no longer have to certify services for end of year. And even for fall 1 services, you don't have to do services for fall 1 either. Why? Are we getting rid of services? No. We're just working on the development of ODS reports, because everybody knows what that means now, that are going to be more timely and will show your LEA and your CELPA where you may be submitting services incorrectly, okay? But you're not required to certify them. New reports that we're going to talk about today. These are your new exit reports, 1622 and 1623. So it's going to show kids' statuses as of the end of the year and their appropriate non-participation reason codes, which you guys know as either plan type 700, 800, 900, or special education exits. Okay, ODS reports. So we were trying to work on a report that would show you not only parent involvement, but also the trans reg, the transition indicators. That's not going to happen for the trans regs, but I'll show you where to verify it. Okay, we are working on a report for parent involvement. Okay, so we're going to be able to show you that report. Hopefully, it's not going to be available on May 7th, but shortly after the window opens, you should see a report that'll show you all of your parent involvement. Timely evaluations. Unfortunately, that one's not going to make it in to the end of year submission, but I told you I'll show you a trick with 1621 where you can identify those kids. All right. So what should you look for in the reports? So who typically, based on your current experience, is involved in the review process for these certification reports? Just name some roles of people, typically. SPED director. Okay, who else? Data analyst, so your SPED data coordinator, CALPADS administrator. Anybody else? The ARES administrator? Yeah, your SIS administrator. So yes, all of those individuals have to be involved in the review process. Now, specifically for your SPED directors, how do they know what to look for? She said they don't. And you know why? You know how we know that? Because we hear stories all the time. So I did what you told me to, Randy. I downloaded the certification report and I emailed it to my director. And then I got an email back with a thumbs up emoji. Looks good, right? 10 minutes. Apparently that's being generous. So, but why do you think they do that? They have no clue what they're supposed to be looking for. Okay, so I'm going to show you some really simple reviews that you can do in these reports, even before your SPED director looks at them. Because really, again, what I told you, when you're talking about annual determinations and the areas of data for annual determinations and the areas of data for the annual performance reports, all of these little reviews that I'm going to show you will directly impact that, right? So what are your counts of students who were reported as graduates? What are the counts of students that were reported as dropouts? Those are the lenses that you have to kind of look at these things through, because even though you don't see it typically, your SPED directors are going to see it. So I'm going to teach you some really easy things. And then who has the final say typically? Who says, yes, this is good to go? Superintendent should be superintendent, special education director, and Sherry. But within your LEA, right, there has to be someone who says, yes, this is good. And somebody who knows that they're ultimately going to be held accountable for whatever is certified. All right. So here's the first report, 1612. This is your annual cumulative child count. It's different from fall 1 because fall 1 is 1 day. First Wednesday in October. This is a cumulative count of all students between July 1st and June 30th that were enrolled in your LEA, that were eligible and participating. That's really important. You're not going to see exited kids on here. You should only see kids who were enrolled in your LEA and were eligible and participating at some point during that academic year. Okay, so when I'm looking at this report, I want to review the plan types. So how many of you run infant programs, Part C programs? Okay. So anybody else in this room, if you don't run an infant program and you're looking at plan type IFSP and you see counts in there, that's wrong. If you don't run an infant program, you should not have kids on IFSPs. Also, you have a very unique arrangement here in Sonoma County for private school placements. So when you're looking at plan type 150, if you know you don't have any private school placements, you're not serving kids on ISPs at your district, then that should be 0. Or if you know that you have private school placements and the counts are 0, then you need to pay attention to that. Also, make sure you're reviewing counts by primary disability. So what are the counts of students? And compare that to what is in your special education data system. Now, having said that, unfortunately in SACE, there really isn't a way to look back at history. Okay, so what you can, there is a student report that you can run in SACE that allows you to see counts by primary disability, but it's based on what is in SACE right now, whatever's current. So really, if you're doing that comparison, you want to look at it through the lens of reasonability. Okay, so if you're seeing that counts are really high in one of the primary disabilities as opposed to what's in CALPADS, or vice versa, it's too low, then you want to make sure that you validate that piece of information, that you take a look at it. The other thing is, look at prior year's report. Does anybody know how to find last year's report? Okay, so if you don't know how to do this, I'm going to show you how to do this. Because it's one of the questions we get most on the service desk. Like, I can't go into snapshot reports and find 16.1 anymore for end of year. I can't find it. So what you can do is go into certification status, LEA approval, and I think most of you only see LEA approval anyway. Okay, so if you go in there and you toggle back to the prior academic year, okay, so here I want to look at 22-23 and hit search. What it's going to do is it's going to pull up all of my snapshot reports that I certified in the prior year, and I can find 16.1 from last year's end of year 4 submission. Okay, so I go to end of year 4, I would click on that, and then I would find the report. You cannot find it in the snapshot report menu. It's not there anymore. Okay, but you can find it in your certification status. Everybody clear on that? But the point is, you want to compare 16.1 for end of year 4 to this report that you're looking at. Because if you're seeing those variances by primary disabilities, that's kind of a big deal, right? So here, 16.1, it's right there. All right, next, 16.14. This is a student list, really, really important. We talked about trans regs. How do you verify your transition indicators? This is the only report you're gonna be able to see it in. The only report. So typically, again, download the CSV file, okay? And in your CSV file, if you're looking for the transition indicators, what you want to do is actually you want to apply a filter before you run the report. So you're looking for kids that are 16 years old and older, okay? 16 years old and up. Download the report, and then what you want to look at is the columns here, transition and post-secondary info. You'll notice, so I ran this report with that filter, and you'll notice that there are 3 kids that have nothing in there. It's blank. So what does that mean? It means that the plan that overlaps my enrollment period has blanks in there, which means that many of those kids might have transferred into your districts, and the plan that was developed at the other district, they weren't 16 yet. But by the time they came to you, they were 16 years old and the indicators weren't in there. So what do you have to do to fix it? Any idea? Do I hold an IEP? That's what she said. No, that's not actually how you fix this. If when they came into your district, those goals were not in the IEP, you need to say no. You need to put ends in here, particularly for kids that are transferring in. So they'll transfer in, you adopt that IEP. All those fields might be blank. you'll actually get a data discrepancy also that's going to tell you these aren't populated. So at the time they came to you, that IEP, it was blank. So you just need to make sure you put no's if there were no transition indicators populated. Then you can hold an IEP to make sure that they are populated, but oftentimes that occurs after. Okay, because this is the record that it's looking for based on the plan effective start date. Okay, you need to make sure it either says yes or no. There should be no blanks for 16-year-old and up. So if we see that it's blank when we're sending up the transaction and we populate the transaction with the no's, does it relieve us from the responsibility of the transition goals not being populated late? No, it does not. But what it does is it prevents, it'll allow you to certify. And those are the data that we use. But, you know, right. So why am I held accountable if the other district didn't do it? Because now the student is enrolled with you. I mean, honestly, that's kind of unfortunately how special education works. So if a student transfers in and the other district, for whatever reason, was not able to get done what needed to be done, because now they're enrolled with you, you're on the hook for it. But once we get it in place, we'll be good. Sure, yeah, once you get it done. Now, when you say it won't count against me, anything in this report is going to count towards indicator 13, which is my transition indicators. Anything you see in this report, if you have no's in there, it is going to impact your annual performance reports. I can tell you that, unfortunately. Yes. So can case managers actually go into the IEP and populate no's and send it up? No, I believe, Sherry, you have to modify the transaction, not the IEP. Yeah, you have to modify the transaction because the IEP doesn't include those indicators. So yeah, you have to modify the transaction and you can send it up and say, or you go into the record in CALPADS and you populate the transition indicators in the plan record, okay? Another thing that you want to look at, you want to compare the school of attendance and program setting. So if I'm in a traditional school within the district, what should my program setting typically be? 400, regular classroom. Compare that. If you see any kids that say separate school or a setting that you don't expect, that's a red flag. Conversely, if you have a student enrolled in an NPS school, so school code 000001, and their program setting is regular classroom 400, that's probably wrong. Okay, so you need to make sure that you fix that. Also, when we were going through these training sessions early on, Dominic caught something in this report that I didn't see before. So here, if you look at this second row, you have this student whose program setting is 400. Look at their gen ed participation, 1%. Does that seem correct? No, it's probably transposed, right? It's probably 99%, okay? Which means that you got to go back and modify that through an amendment, okay? If that's how it's populated in SACE. And then finally, verify primary residency code for accuracy in this report. So if they're in a residential placement, your primary residence code needs to say residential placement. So there's some really simple things that you can look for. So Sherry, are there other things that you look for in 1614? Okay. So percent in, percent out for your speech only preschool age students is often incorrect. Okay, so you need to look at those. All right, here are your new reports. These are your exit reports. This is the aggregate counts Okay, and I know oftentimes these aggregate reports are not really very, very helpful, but just to kind of give you an understanding of what you're seeing here. So every student that was enrolled in your district over the academic year is going to be in this report. That's a student with disabilities. Every single student. Most of them were eligible and participating and did not exit special education. So if they were eligible and participating, they're going to show up in this bucket here, participating. You don't really need to worry about those. But for all the others, eligible not participating, eligible not enrolled, and not eligible, as you know, you have to identify a non-participation reason code in CALPADS. What does that look like in SACE? Non-participation reason codes are either plan types 700, 800, 900, or they're a special education exit that aligns with one of the no consent from C to B, max age, withdrawal, not eligible, return to California, no longer eligible, or left school, not expected to return. Okay, so what you're doing on this aggregate report is you're looking at counts of students in SACE with plan types 700, 800, 900 to make sure that they're showing up in the right buckets. So 700 is 11, 800 is 12, 900 is 21. And then making sure all of your other exits and the counts of students in those buckets are in the appropriate exit buckets. Okay. Now, the next report is the detail report. Okay, this is the student list associated with that. I want you to download this report, again, in the CSV format. That's really important. And one of the really cool things that will be on this report, these will not be available May 7th either, by the way, shortly after they'll be available. But one of the really cool things on this report is not only will you see the student status, and if they exited their non-participation reason code, but it's also going to show you their exit date, exit reason, and completion status. That is really important that you review that. Because again, as I told you, there are some school-related exit codes that are going to affect their status. So what we did, in order to help you review this report, we put together a document that's in your meeting materials folder. It's appropriate SWDS status and non-participation reason code for student exit reasons and completion statuses. So say that 5 times fast. Okay, so essentially that document looks like this. It's an Excel spreadsheet that will sort of help you with the review, right? So if I go here, okay, here's what I'm looking at. So what it does is it takes every single exit code and says, okay, if you have this exit code, then the status should be eligible, not enrolled, left school, not expected to return. If it's not, then there's an issue, okay? Other things like this one. Let's look at this. So completer exit. So a completer exit where they graduated with a standard high school diploma. What is the expected status in CALPADS? Not eligible. Non-participation reason code, not eligible. So when you are doing your reviews, filter those reports for their school exits. Look at all of the E230 100s and see what their statuses are. Yes, Sherry. Okay, so what about your transition kids? They've completed grade 12. They're going to move on to a transition program, and they may not be on a diploma track. So how do those get reported as exits? Those kids, what we would expect to see for those students, because they are continuing on, they're not exiting special education. So first of all, you wouldn't see an exit here. But their exit code should be E156. E156, yes. So if they're not returning to your district and they're going to be attending a transition program in another district, then you would exit them as a T160. T160, which is a transfer to another California public school. Yes. Yes, transfer in SACE. Does that make sense? All right. So please use this document because it will help you. Yes. Does it include the alternative pathway diploma? This does include the alternative pathway diploma. But this spreadsheet does include the alternative pathway diploma. So what she's talking about is 102. It's right here. But do we expect to see any of the alternative pathway diploma graduates this year? No. Right, because you had to have entered ninth grade in 22, 23, right? So we don't expect. Now, if there's some genius kid who graduates in 2 years or who earns their credits in 2 years, totally get it. Yeah. So this is available for use, but we don't expect to see any of these this year at all. Okay. So please utilize this when you are reviewing this report. But the other thing you want to pay attention to when you download this, look for kids who have enrollment statuses or excuse me, enrollment exits that are high school graduates, because those may be counted in some of your indicators, like indicator 1, high school graduate. Also pay attention to exit codes that equate to dropouts. Those are very, very important. And folks, really important that you understand, sometimes E155s, E156 end up as lost transfers. And those lost transfers equate to dropouts for your district if they had their initial ninth grade entry in your district. Okay, so you need to pay attention to those because they will get included in your cohorts as dropouts or non-grads. Okay, all right. Remember I told you about your kids who have 100 hours of work experience. Oh, no, that's actually not this report, sorry. Post-secondary survey. So what you're looking for here is all the kids you surveyed, making sure all of their results are in here. So I told you that in SACE, they have a report that you can run to find those kids, but also in CALPADS, they have a report, an ODS report. It's 8.1A, student profile exits. So if you entered in all of the appropriate completion statuses and exit codes into that report, run the filter, and look for kids that exited in the prior year, you can find a comprehensive list. And those are all the kids that you should have surveyed. You need to make sure there are results in here for every single one of those kids, even if it's did not respond or refused to answer. Also, if any of these kids on this report re-enrolled for 23-24, they should not be on this report. If they came back for transition services, they don't belong on this report. Okay, so that's another really easy glaring thing to look at. All right, so there are some ODS reports that you have to review. How many of you are familiar with the cohort outcome report? Yeah, I kind of expected that. All right, so those of you that are in the SPED realm probably have never looked at this report because it doesn't really affect you. It's not one of your certification reports, okay? But it does affect you. And remember I talked about those indicators, those annual performance reports? One of them is how many students with disabilities graduated within the 4-year cohort. And this is the only report in CALPADS that will show you that. So if you don't have access to 15.2, you need to get access to 15.2. And more importantly, what you're looking for is if you run this report with the students with disabilities filter, you're looking at this cohort category where that purple box is, and you're looking for anybody that's listed as a dropout, okay? Which means that their enrollment exit code has an indication that they dropped out. Those can be fixed before the end of year amendment window ends, okay? Which means if they transferred out of state, if they transferred out of the country, if they transferred to a private school, any of those things, and their exit code isn't reflecting that, they can actually be removed from your cohort if that's actually what happened, okay? You don't want kids identified as dropouts if they're not, and it's all based on their enrollment exit codes, okay? It's important for you for your annual determinations as well as your annual performance reports. Okay, there were ODS reports. There are ODS reports still in development. We talked about the parental involvement, which will be coming a little bit later. But the as I told you, the late initials, we're not going to be able to get that one in. But you can use 1621 to actually find some of these kids who have late initials. All right. So if I go to 1621 and I run the report as of today, and I'm looking only for kids who are 3, okay, because that's really the population you're talking about. Kids 3 years old, or even sometimes older, 3 years or older, should have IEPs in place by the time they're 3, or they have to have that initial evaluation done within 60 days. So if I want to find the kids that have late meetings within 60 days, what I can do is I can run the report as of today. In the student age filter, I select 3 and higher, and I want to click view the report and download it. So now I'm only looking at kids who should be on Part B plans. Sort it by the parental consent date. Okay, so I look at my 1621 here. If I go over here and I sort this, let's just say all these kids are 3. They're not in this case, but if I sort it by initial parental consent date for evaluation, and I sort oldest to newest, okay, I'm looking at this parental consent date as compared to the current date. If that current date has exceeded 60 days, then this student is overdue. Also, you want to check the SPED meeting date if one is populated here, okay? If there's a SPED meeting date and that has exceeded 60 days, it means the student is late. So you want to make sure, in this case, that they have a meeting delay code. If they, bless you, if they don't have a meeting delay code, you need to make sure that's populated. Now, the other thing that you can do, if you're looking at third birthdays, is student birth date is something that's provided in this report. So very easily, I can insert a column here and I can do a function to find out how many of these kids are 3 years or older, or I can compare their birth date to the meeting date. Okay, if I compare it to the meeting date and the meeting type in here is a Part C initial, okay, it means they haven't had their Part B meeting. Okay, but I can use information in this report, and I know that's a lot, but Dominic is also working on another tutorial to teach you guys how to do this, because unfortunately we're not going to get that timely initial report in for end of year. Okay, so that is forthcoming probably within the next couple of weeks. Yes. Right. So yeah, that's a good point. So just as a point of clarification, remember when you're doing your transition meetings from Part C to Part B, the student is on the Part C plan until when? Third birthday. Therefore, the meeting, although the meeting can be held at 2 years, 9 months, that plan effective start date needs to be what? Third birthday, right? That's why you guys are getting some errors, because now you're getting an error that's saying, hey, this kid is not old enough to be on a Part B plan, because you're holding the meeting 2 years, 9 months. Your case managers need to make sure that plan effective start date reflects their third birthday. Yes. So services would start the first day of school. So that plan effective start date needs to be on or after their third birthday. So it could be their third birthday at the plan effective start date, but if you want to reflect that they're going to start services later on, you could use a future effective start date, sure. Okay, so that's a very, very key point. All right, so We're going to put together a video for you so you don't have to remember everything I just spewed into your heads right now. Okay, so incident data. End of year 3. This is what you're certifying, or this is what it's used for. So the dashboard, data quest, public reporting at the state level and local level for restraint and seclusion, federal reporting for IDEA, and then for the annual performance report, we're looking at indicators 4A and 4B, which identifies, by the way, whether or not you are suspending or expelling students with disabilities by race ethnicity category at a higher rate than their general education peers, or within a specific race and ethnicity category. So what are you certifying? You're certifying all incidents involving ed code violations that fall under 48900 or 48915, even if they weren't suspended or expelled. Okay, so even if you did other means of correction, you still have to report the incident. And furthermore, if a student with disabilities was, well, all students actually, if students were restrained or secluded, you have to report that incident even if it wasn't associated with an ed code violation. Okay. The restraint and seclusion ed code section is 49005.1. So what's important about incident data for all students is understanding that it's tracked in ARIES. It's not tracked in SACE. Okay, so therefore you have to have a process to get information on incidents for students with disabilities populated into the student information system. So here's my question. Specifically for NPS sites, how many of your districts refer students to non-public schools? Okay, so my question is, how are you being notified that students at those NPS schools have incidents? They send a report. What does it look like? What's it called? Behavior emergency report. Okay, so what are you doing with those? Okay, you put it in the SIS. Yes. Google form. Okay, so you've got a process. Does anybody not have that process? Because what I typically, and it's okay. Here's what I hear is you may get that information from the NPS. You may get the behavioral emergency report. It goes to the CELPA sometimes. It goes to the special education director, and that's where it stays. Okay, so sometimes it goes to case managers, and you put it in a hard copy file. Okay, that information, those behavioral emergency reports, I'm telling you, there's a direct correlation. There's information in there sometimes that's indicative of an ed code violation, right? There's information that's indicative of any incidents of restraint or seclusion. So if you're not getting that information over to your SIS administrator, you are not reporting all of your required data, specifically for your NPS sites. Okay. Furthermore, any behavioral emergency report for students at your district, if that's not making its way into your student information system, you are not reporting restraint and seclusion, right? Also, there are specific data that we collect for students with disabilities regarding incidents that is tracked in the SIS that's maybe not in SACE. So, was instructional support provided during the suspension or expulsion? Yes or no? Okay. Was this student removed to an interim alternative setting, which you guys call 45-day placements? 45-day placements are typically documented on an incident report, and it's a unilateral removal, which means it's done by a school administrator. It's not done by the IEP team, and it's for really egregious offenses. It's like drug-related, weapons-related offenses, severe bodily harm. So CALPADS administrators, please do not make this determination. Talk to your SPED directors because they can probably help you identify any student that has removals to an interim alternative setting. And then the incident result authority code. So all of those things are required for students with disabilities. So you guys have to work together to populate a lot of this information. All right, so here's the first report that you guys have to certify for students with disabilities and their incidents. And here's what you need to look for. First of all, find out what's the percentage of your students with disabilities that are being removed. So how do you do that? There's a total number of students removed column. Okay, so in this case, the total is 75. So if I want to find out, given my entire population of students with disabilities, whether or not that's reasonable, I can go to 16.12, which has my total count, cumulative count, and I can look, what is my count of students that I had for the students with disabilities, and then what percentage of them are being removed? That's something your special education director probably wants to know. It's like, do we have a really high percentage of these? Because guess what? If you do, then it's probable that it could lead to other things like disproportionality. Check for any students removed to an interim alternative setting. So these purple boxes that you see here, if there's any zeros is what we want to see in these boxes. One, how many do you typically have, Sherry, in a given year in Sonoma County? Less than 5 in the entire year over all of the districts within Sonoma County. So if you're seeing counts in there, it means, and you're seeing like 5 or 6 at your district, it's wrong. I can already tell you, it's wrong. Okay, sure. Right. So she's saying kids who were suspended but never came back. That doesn't qualify as an interim removal. No, an interim removal is something very specific. It means the kid was going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, and so the administrators had to place them somewhere else in another school for no longer than 45 days. Okay, that's a complete, totally different scenario. Yes.
Brandy?
Hold on one second, Milo.
Okay, sure.
Are we talking about kids that leave the school because they need mental health treatment? No, that is not that. Again, folks, if you have any questions, talk to your special education directors. This has to be comprehensively documented within an incident report. Okay, so if you're questioning it, talk to either your CELPA or your SPED directors to find out whether or not it was a 45-day placement. Yes, Milo, do you have a question?
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Sonia at 11:35. What about reports of restraints that happen after school hours at the residential facility?
Okay, so if you have students in residential placements, anything that happens in the residential portion of that facility after school hours is not reportable. Okay, in the residential portion, that's very important. Thanks, Milo.
Thanks, Brandy.
Okay, then just nice segue into that topic. Look at, so this is a report I ran for a very large district, and they had reported 0 restraint or seclusion for any of their students with disabilities. Now, not to say that we want to see any counts here, but is it probable? If this district has 25,000 students with disabilities, is it probable that they didn't have one incident? Okay. Red flag, glaring neon red flag. Please pay attention to that section of this report. If there's zeros in there, it's wrong. I guarantee it. Check with your SPED directors, make sure all behavioral emergency reports and that information is entered into the student information system before you verify that that's correct. Your administrators should not be approving this report with zeros if you know that there have been behavioral emergency reports. Okay, here's the student list, 7.18. Number 1, if there are no students from NPS schools on this report, verify it. Maybe it's accurate. Maybe you had no incidents at your non-public schools. But folks, I mean, if we're being realistic, those are the most restrictive environments. And unfortunately, incidents like this happen more often at those facilities. So if there are no NPS kids on this report, verify that that's accurate. Check with your NPS, your SPED directors. Next, filter, if you look at offense type, the student offense, so the very last column that I've outlined in purple there, look for offense code 511, which is defiance or disruption. And if you're seeing a student on there and that's their only offense and they were suspended or expelled for solely defiance or disruption, you need to talk to the site administrators because that's illegal. You can't do that, okay? This is after the fact, but you need to talk to them because it's not appropriate to suspend or expel anybody in K-12 for solely defiance or disruption. Okay, also, if the student was exited from special education on the incident date, so incident occurrence date, if they were not in special education, they should not be on this report. Okay, so what does that mean? I have to fix their status to reflect that they were not in special education on the incident date. And then is the duration of the suspension or expulsion correct? Okay, so take a look at their duration days. Does it look accurate? Remember that for your annual determinations, we're looking at kids who were suspended or expelled more than 10 days. So make sure that the duration is correct. And then finally, are the offenses correct? Even though it doesn't affect your annual determinations, remember we post these data on DataQuest. And oftentimes what we see in terms of the student offenses, so I always tell this story, a reporter got a hold of some of the data on DataQuest for a particular district. And this district had an abnormally high number of offenses for kindergarten students of sexual assault. So they started digging, and it was literally just a data entry error. They were selecting the wrong code, okay? So make sure that the offenses are correct because it is publicly available. Yes? So can we use this report to determine whether or not a manifestation determination should have been done? I don't think so. I mean, can you think of a way, Sherry, that you could use it for that? No, unfortunately. Okay, so moving on, 7.12. Many of you may not have access to 7.12. You know why? Because it's a general education. It includes gen ed students. So your CALPADS administrators are very territorial. They're like, no, special education director, you cannot have access to a report with gen ed data. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm doing an impression of my Uncle Tony, by the way. Okay, so they need access to this. Here's why. When you are determining whether or not your students with disabilities are being disproportionately suspended as compared to their gen ed peers, yeah, they have to know who the gen ed peers are. They have to see the counts of gen ed students that are being suspended or expelled. Give them access to this report because they need it for federal indicators 4A and 4B, which lead to disproportionality in suspension or expulsion. They have to have access to this report. So what you can do is if you take this report and you download those results into Excel, and Excel has a really cool subtotal function that you can run. So if you're looking for subtotals, I want to see subtotals for SSID and duration days. Tell me the total cumulative duration days that student was suspended or expelled. If it's more than 10, I want to identify those students with disabilities because that's what counts in 4A and 4B. Okay, so really easy things that you can do with this report. And then you could also do it for gen ed students. All right, restraint or seclusion. Let's talk a little bit about this. We started collecting data in 2019-20 for all students, not just students with disabilities. These are the questions that most frequently come up. What is a mechanical restraint? When do I have to report it? Okay, so if the mechanical restraint meets the following criteria. So it means the use of a device or equipment to restrict a pupil's freedom of movement. First of all, it does not include any mechanical restraints used by law enforcement, peace officers, school security personnel. It's like handcuffs that are used by a police officer. You do not have to report that. It also does not include any device that's used for its intended purpose by a trained staff person. So for example, adaptive devices or mechanical supports, vehicle safety restraints, restraints for medical immobilization or orthopedically prescribed devices, as long as those devices are being used for what they were intended for and they're being applied by people who understand how to use them, you don't have to report those as well. Physical restraint means a restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a pupil to move the pupil's torso, arms, legs, or head freely. It does not include a physical escort of a student from one location to another so that they're safe. And it also doesn't include any physical restraint applied by a police officer, school security personnel, law enforcement. Okay, you don't have to report those. Seclusion, that means the involuntary confinement of a pupil alone in a location where they are physically prevented from leaving. So if they're in there with a staff member, do you have to report the seclusion in CALPADS? No, you don't. If they're in a room alone, but the door's not locked, they can walk out. Do you have to report that? No. Okay, so all of these definitions are in the statute. But here's the problem. Here's what the data have shown. Here's the number of LEAs that reported in the very first year, 313. Second year, tanked, COVID year, right? Then we never rebounded, folks. The number of districts that report these data is only, last year was 291 districts, and they're all the same districts that have been reporting all along. Okay, which means to me and to the disability rights advocates that you guys are not reporting these data. In fact, there's a huge lawsuit that's happening in San Francisco right now because of this, because kids are being restrained or secluded and you guys are not reporting the data. You're not reporting those incidents, okay? Here's why, and we just talked about it. Behavioral emergency reports are not being entered into the student information system, okay? Furthermore, some of your master contracts that you have with non-public schools are not specific enough so that they understand the reporting requirements, okay? So review your master contracts. Take a look at that. And Sherry, you're gonna be at State SELPA? Oh, okay. So we are going to be recommending some master contract language, voluntary, but check, because it has to be really specific so that your NPS sites know what they have to send you and how often, right? The other thing that we're reviewing, by the way, is your behavioral emergency reports. If you take a look at those, is it really easy to discern what the ed code violation was? What CALPADS code to use? Suspended or expelled, restrained or secluded? Was it done by a police officer or not? No, it's not. When we looked at those behavioral emergency reports, they're great. They're great forms, but for the SIS administrator or for the person who has to provide that information, when do you know when you have to provide it? It's not clear enough. So we're also going to be making some recommendations to you guys about things you could change on those BEAR forms to make it really explicit when that is a reportable incident. Okay, also key disciplinary staff clearly are not looking or don't know what to look at in the certification reports. There's zeros in restraint and seclusion. That is very likely an issue. Here's why it matters. Next year, we're going to be using your restraint and seclusion data that you report this year for your annual monitoring determinations. So most cases, zero would be a good thing. Zero over the last 4 years is a bad thing. Okay, so within the next couple of days, all of your SELPA directors are going to be receiving a file that shows your district's reporting for restraint and seclusion, including how many NPS kids you have, how many gen ed kids you have, how many gen ed kids were restrained or secluded, how many students with disabilities were restrained or secluded, how many NPS kids were restrained or secluded, and how many times that happened for those kids, So they're going to have that information, and we're going to ask them to reach out to you to help you improve your processes. Because if it's all zeros for 21, 22, and 22, 23, we have a problem. No, Thomas, I am not available. Okay. All right.
Hey,
so
Brandy.
yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we did have a question in the chat at 11:39. So it says, we keep being told that schools with 0 are being flagged. However, as virtual charters, we often do not have any incidents to report, as students are schooled in the home. Please advise on if this will be considered when schools report 0.
All right. So if you are a virtual charter, yeah, we are going to take that into consideration. Obviously, I mean, if we counted restraint and seclusion and my kid was at home, we would have big problems. No. So yeah, we will take that into account. But again, you know, if you're a virtual charter, there are ways that we can identify that within our public school directory. And yes, in that case, we would expect 0. Okay. But what here really, we're talking about LEA level though. I mean, we're looking at districts over the course of the last 4 years that have reported absolutely nothing. In fact, I'm going to show some data to your CELPA directors. 77,000 kids, 4 years, nothing, 0. Okay. That's a very big problem. And it's just more process than anything, because it doesn't mean you guys aren't documenting them. It just means you're not putting them in the SIS. Okay, I just talked about all these things, but we're also working with our NPS unit at the department to kind of, again, work out some master contract language that you might want to put in, modifications that you can make to the behavioral emergency forms. So if you want to find out what you reported, and if you're at risk, and if you should be really paying attention to your data, take a look, because it's publicly reported on the state websites. Take a look at what you reported at some point. All right. Work-based learning. This is those kids, students with disabilities that completed 100 hours of workability, Department of Rehab Services, work experience over 9 through 12. Any kids who took 4 semesters of classroom-based work exploration. Look at those last 2 columns, transition-based work experience and transition classroom-based work exploration, codes 60 and 65. This is in the student information system. If there are zeros there and you know you have kids that meet those criteria, provide that information to your student information system so they can put it in there. So you guys get credit for your students with disabilities in the career and college indicator on the dashboard. All right, this is it. Last 5 minutes, promise. Other local auditing. Okay, remember I showed you those data discrepancies, how you can look forward and see errors that are in the future. Plan 619. These are your kids that are transitioning from an early childhood setting to a regular classroom because they're entering transitional kindergarten or kindergarten and they're 5 years old. So you need to be paying attention to that and start working on identifying those kids on or after July 1st. Okay, because if that meeting is not going to be held until, if their next annual is not due until after Information Day, you're going to have to hold amendments for those kids. If their meeting, however, occurs between July 1st and before the first Wednesday in October, then you can just make the changes in their annual meeting, okay, update their program setting. But if their next annual isn't projected out until after the first Wednesday in October, which I think this year is the 2nd or I don't know. But first Wednesday in October, then you're going to need to hold amendments. So plan 619. So be looking for those after July 1st. Make sure you're reviewing the gen ed percentage, as we talked about. Some of those percentages are transposed. It's the percentage in general education, not percentage out of general education. Make sure you're reviewing those percentages by case manager, because sometimes the same case manager is making the same mistake over and over and over. Look at your special day classes. Do they have gen ed percentages that are too high? And do your speech language pathologists have percentages that are too low? All right, pending meeting types for your annual and your reevaluations. How do you get these up from SACE? How do you tell us that that an annual is pending for a valid delay reason, or that a reevaluation is pending? Enter it directly into CalPads in online maintenance. SACE, you cannot get them up through SACE. So 1621 is going to show overdues based on the data in CalPads. If you send up a record that says, here's why I'm not holding the annual yet. Here's why I'm not reevaluating yet. With a valid delay code, guess what? Their monitoring category moves from overdue to timely. And then populating degree of support. Okay, so we changed this, by the way, and you're not going to be required to have this in by fall. You are going to need to populate this over the course of the next year during a naturally triggering event, meaning if the student's having their plan review, they're being reevaluated, you're holding an amendment meeting, then you should update the degree of support. Now, having said that, it's not part of the IEP document, okay? And SACE is not requiring it. So you're going to have to develop a process where they understand this is going to need to be populated for kids with certain primary and secondary disabilities. So in your meeting materials, there is the guidance that we put together for degree of support and how to identify that for each of these kids with those primary and secondary disabilities. So just make sure that you're populating that over the course of the year. Okay? And you will only have to populate one. The degree of support 2 field is being changed into a filler field. You don't have to populate anything in that. But you want to make sure that you get that populated throughout the course of the year because it is going to be required in 25, 26. Yes. Emotional disturbance. So the question is this only being evaluated for an assignment monitoring perspective for students who are in a special education setting or what we know in CalPads as an instructional strategy code of 700? And that is correct. But remember, you're identifying the degree of support for the student, and only when they are placed in a special day class that's a special education setting will they be evaluated for that degree of support, or will the teachers be evaluated against that degree of support? So again, it's not this. So you will get an error if you don't populate this for certain primary or secondary disabilities. Yes. So I would not use that criteria of are they in a special setting class or not, because at some point they could be. That's the point. Right? Because this is going to be used every single year, right? Yes. Yeah, are your teachers appropriately authorized? But here's what I'm going to tell you. This next year, I just had a meeting with CTC. They're not going to be using the degree of support this year at all in assignment monitoring. It's not going to be evaluated until 25, 26. Okay? And as soon as we have more information about that, I will provide it to you. Who's populating it? So it's a local determination because it's not necessarily the IEP team during an IEP meeting. Okay. But it has to be a combination of special education staff, either the SPED coordinator and or parts of the IEP team that, number one, make the determination, but make sure that it's populated. Okay. We're also working on a suggested change from SACE, which is that we allow a value of not applicable in that field. So that way SACE can require that you populate it for every student with those primary and secondary disabilities, but if it's, for any disability, but if it's not one of the appropriate disabilities, you would select not applicable. That way they can require it and it's done. So at some point somebody has to fill it in. So we're working on that potential change request. All right, real quickly, because it's time for you to go. We are updating the meeting delay codes. You guys have been asking for this for many, many years. We put the proposed revised definitions in your meeting materials. If you don't like what we're proposing, you need to let us know very soon. Yes. So the parents requesting that the IEP meeting be held at a later date. And so there is no, so parent, you probably could use, because we're changing the code because it says parent did not make child available. That's if you look at the revised definition, it's parent did not make themselves or child available. Yeah, there we go, right? Look, that's why, look at the definitions. Tell us whether you agree with them or not. If you don't, please send us suggestions, okay? Because we have a very small window to make changes. Okay, so take a look at those. The other thing that's going to be changing is the meetings that you can use those with, okay? And we're making some, and that is explicitly in every single definition. So if you can use it for an initial, it'll say initial in the definition. If you can use it for an annual, if you can use it for a reevaluation, it's written into the definition. Okay, so please take a look at those. Next, non-participation reason codes. So actually this is some of this is because of you, Sherry. You know where we're going, okay. So next year, you will not be able to use the withdrawal code anymore. That's not Sherry, by the way. But you won't be able to use 78 withdrawal. As of June 30th, you cannot use that anymore. What do you use? You use 28 and 29. 28, not eligible, written revocation. That means the person has provided a written revocation of special education services. Okay. Versus 29, eligible, cessation of service without revocation. And everybody goes, well, that doesn't happen. Our legal office reviewed that and says, no, that doesn't happen. Yeah, no, yes, it does. It does. Here's when it happens. Preschool students, initially evaluated, parent signs the IEP, they disappear. And they don't revoke. Happens all the time. You would use 29. Okay, here's the other time it happens. Parent, students on an IEP, takes them out, moves them to a private school. Does not want ISP services, but they won't revoke. And you use 29. Okay, because it's the difference between needing another initial evaluation and needing an annual. So if they revoke, you need an initial. If they don't revoke, they just stop services, you just need to do an annual or a re-eval. Question? Yeah, it's not compulsory. Yep, there you go. Eligible. Yep, 29. Okay. The other change, and this is Sherry, is 27, not eligible, no parental consent for initial provision of special education and services. So what that means is as I'm going through the initial evaluation process, it's 3 steps. Number 1, I have to get consent for the assessment. Step 2, the parent has to say, yes, I want my child in special education. Step 3 is, does the parent agree with part or all of the offer of FAPE? A 3-step process. Okay. If the parent says, no, I don't want special education services, then you would use 27, which means they are not eligible for special education. And if they want to re-enter, they have to do a subsequent initial. Versus a parent who says, yes, I want special education services, but I don't agree with your offer of FAPE. I don't want your offer of FAPE. In that case, the student is eligible, but not participating. Okay, does that make sense? So these codes will start being available as of July 1st in CALPADS and should be in your special education data systems. All of these changes, because we did update all of the non-participation reason code definitions as well. Take a look, it's in your meeting materials link. All right, that is it. We are done, but just wanted to point you out an online maintenance demo. Big props to the folks over at CSIS, particularly Alex Thandi, who formerly Manriquez, who did the online maintenance demo. So if you want to know how to enter those records and what's required and what you should be populating in those fields, she did a great YouTube video. So take a look at it. Just know that it's there as a resource.